The crystalline halls of the Terran royal palace gleamed under the artificial suns that had replaced Earth's dying star 3 centuries ago. Captain Marcus Kane stood at attention outside the diplomatic wing, his enhanced cybernetic eye scanning the thermal signatures of everyone within a 50-meter radius. As the head of Prince George's personal security detail, Marcus had seen his share of political tensions, but nothing quite like what was brewing today. The Galactic Council had been in session for 3 standard days, and tempers were running higher than usual. Representatives from 12 different species had gathered to discuss humanity's latest expansion into the Outer Rim territories, and not everyone was pleased with mankind's rapid colonization efforts. The humans had earned their reputation as the most aggressive explorers and terraformers in known space, often pushing into regions other species considered too dangerous or unprofitable to settle. Marcus adjusted his tactical vest, feeling the familiar weight of his plasma rifle against his shoulder. His augmented hearing picked up fragments of heated conversation from within the council chamber. The Zeltharian ambassador was making another complaint about human mining operations in the Kepler system, while the Arcturus trade delegate voiced concerns about humanity's reckless disregard for established shipping lanes. Prince George, third in line to the Terran throne, had been tasked with smoothing over these diplomatic rough spots. At 28 years old, the prince had inherited his grandmother's sharp wit and his father's military bearing, making him an effective negotiator when he chose to be. Unfortunately, he had also inherited the famous Windsor temper that had caused political incidents for over 1,000 years. The council chamber doors burst open with enough force to send tremors through the reinforced walls. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his weapon as Prince George stormed out, his face flushed with anger and his formal diplomatic robes disheveled. Behind him, the sound of multiple alien languages erupted in what was clearly an argument. "Your Highness," Marcus called out, falling into step beside the prince as he marched down the corridor. "Perhaps we should discuss whatever just happened before you make any decisions you might regret." George whirled around, his eyes blazing with the kind of fury that Marcus had only seen once before, during the Martian rebellion 5 years ago. "Did you hear what that scale bastard said about humanity? About Earth? About our right to exist among the stars?" The captain had indeed heard. Ambassador Vextar of the Reptilian Commonwealth had made some rather inflammatory statements about humanity being an infestation that needed to be contained before it spreads further. The comment had been poorly translated through the universal communicators, but the intent was clear enough. "I heard, sir, but starting an interstellar incident won't help our position with the other council members. Your father specifically instructed me to keep you out of trouble during these negotiations." George laughed bitterly, running a hand through his brown hair. "My father? Yes, let's talk about dear old dad. Do you know what he told me before I left for this summit? He said I needed to show restraint and remember that we're not the only intelligent species in the galaxy. As if I could forget, with creatures like Vextar constantly reminding us that we're apparently too young, too violent, and too ambitious for their liking." The prince began pacing in the wide corridor, his military boots clicking against the polished floor. Marcus had seen this behavior before. George was working himself up to something, and it usually meant trouble for everyone involved. "Sir, with respect, your father's advice seems sound. We've made significant progress with several species over the past decade. The Centauri Alliance has been a valuable trading partner, and the Vegan Republic has provided crucial technology exchanges. We can't afford to alienate the entire council over one ambassador's poor choice of words." "Poor choice of words?" George spun around, jabbing a finger toward the council chamber. He called for economic sanctions against every human colony beyond the Sol system. "He wants to strangle our expansion efforts and keep us trapped in our own backyard like some kind of cosmic children who can't be trusted with sharp objects." Marcus had to admit that the ambassador's proposals were extreme. The Reptilian Commonwealth had been pushing for restrictions on human expansion for months, arguing that mankind's rapid colonization efforts disrupted established territorial boundaries and trade routes. While there was some truth to their concerns, the proposed solutions seemed designed more to hobble human development than to address legitimate grievances. The captain's enhanced hearing detected footsteps approaching from the council chamber. Multiple sets, including the distinctive clicking of Zeltharian claws on stone and the heavy thudding of Ursine delegates. The other species were probably coming to continue the argument or offer diplomatic solutions. Either way, It would be better if Prince George wasn't standing in the hallway, looking ready to start a war. Your Highness, perhaps we should move this conversation to your private quarters. The other delegates are approaching, and I prefer not to have this discussion in a public corridor. George glanced toward the approaching sounds and nodded reluctantly. Fine. But this isn't over, Marcus. I won't stand by and watch them try to cage humanity just because we're more successful at colonization than they are. As they walked toward the prince's quarters, Marcus reflected on the challenges of his position. Protecting a member of the royal family was difficult enough under normal circumstances, but George had a talent for finding trouble in even the most peaceful situations. The prince genuinely cared about humanity's place in the galaxy, but his passion often got the better of his judgment. The royal quarters occupied an entire floor of the diplomatic wing, with rooms designed to accommodate both human and alien physiology. George's personal suite featured Earth-normal atmosphere and gravity, with furniture size for human proportions. The prince immediately moved to the large window that looked out over the palace gardens, where representatives from dozens of species could be seen taking walks or conducting informal meetings. Do you see them out there, Marcus? All these different species, working together, sharing knowledge and resources. That's what the galaxy could be like if they'd give us a real chance. Marcus joined him at the window, watching as a group of cetacean delegates floated in their mobile water tanks alongside several humanoid andromedans. What makes you think they're not giving us a chance, sir? Humanity has been part of the Galactic Council for over 50 years. 50 years as junior members with limited voting rights and constant supervision. They treat us like teenagers who need adult supervision before we can make important decisions. George's voice was bitter with frustration. My grandmother fought in the First Contact Wars. She helped establish the peace treaties that brought humanity into galactic civilization. But we're still seen as the new kids who need to prove themselves over and over again. The prince was referring to Queen Elizabeth IV, who had ruled during humanity's tumultuous introduction to galactic politics. Those early years have been marked by several small conflicts as human and alien interests clashed over territory and resources. The Queen's diplomatic skills had eventually led to the treaties that established Earth as a recognized member of the galactic community, but the process had taken decades and cost thousands of lives. Perhaps they're just being cautious, sir. From their perspective, we're an incredibly young species. Most of the council members have had spaceflight capability for thousands of years. We've had it for less than 500. George turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. That's exactly the problem, Captain. They think our youth makes us dangerous, but they don't understand that it also makes us innovative. We've developed faster-than-light travel, terraforming technology, and artificial intelligence systems that some of these older species still can't match. We should be partners, not students. Before Marcus could respond, his communications implant chimed with an incoming message. The sender was Lord Chancellor Harrison, Prince George's chief advisor, and the man responsible for coordinating the diplomatic mission. The message was brief, but urgent. Council session suspended. Ambassador Vextar demanding formal apology from Prince George. Return to chamber immediately. Marcus showed the message to George, who read it with growing anger. An apology? For what? For existing? For having the audacity to defend my species when he insulted us. Sir, we should find out exactly what happened after you left the chamber. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding that can be resolved diplomatically. The prince was already moving toward his formal diplomatic uniform, hanging in the suite's preparation area. Oh, I'll resolve it diplomatically, all right. But I won't grovel for the privilege of being treated as an equal. Marcus watched with growing concern as George changed into his ceremonial robes. The outfit was designed to project authority and dignity, with gold trim that reflected humanity's growing prosperity and military decorations that demonstrated the prince's service in the colonial defense forces. But Marcus was more concerned with the prince's state of mind than his appearance. Your Highness, before we return to the council chamber, I need to remind you of your father's specific instructions regarding this mission. He was very clear that maintaining diplomatic relationships takes priority over personal pride. George paused in adjusting his ceremonial sword, a weapon that was purely symbolic but carried deep significance in human culture. My father isn't here, Captain. He's dealing with a crisis on Europa, where human colonists are being attacked by unknown raiders. He sent me here to represent humanity's interests, and that's exactly what I intend to do. The situation on Europa was indeed serious. Several human settlements had been hit by coordinated attacks over the past month, with no clear indication of who was responsible. The attacks seemed designed to destabilize human expansion efforts in the Jupiter system, and King William had personally traveled to oversee the investigation and defense efforts. I understand your position, sir, but starting a diplomatic incident won't help the colonists on Europa. We need the Council's support to investigate those attacks and prevent future ones. George finished adjusting his uniform and checked his appearance in the polished metal mirror. You're right about that, Marcus. We do need the Council's support, but we also need their respect, and sometimes respect has to be demanded rather than earned through submission. As they prepared to leave the royal quarters, Marcus made a decision that would prove crucial in the events to come. He activated his secure communication link to the other members of the Royal Guard, alerting them to the potential for trouble in the council chamber. If Prince George was determined to make a stand against Ambassador Vextar, Marcus wanted his team ready for any possible escalation. The walk back to the council chamber felt longer than usual, with tension building with each step. Other delegates they passed in the corridors watched them with obvious interest, clearly aware that something significant was about to happen. Marcus noted the positions of security personnel from various species, mentally calculating response times and potential complications if the situation turned violent. As they approached the council chamber, Marcus could hear voices raised in heated debate. The universal translators were working overtime to convert multiple alien languages into comprehensible English, creating a cacophony of overlapping arguments about human expansion, territorial rights, and galactic law. "Ready, Captain?" George asked, pausing outside the chamber doors. Marcus checked his weapons and communication systems one final time. "Ready, Your Highness. But please remember that whatever happens in their affects more than just your personal honor. The future of human expansion may depend on how we handle the next few minutes." The prince nodded solemnly, then pushed open the doors to face whatever awaited them inside. The council chamber fell silent as Prince George entered, his ceremonial robes rustling against the polished floor. 12 alien species sat arranged in a perfect circle, their various forms creating a bizarre menagerie of galactic life. Marcus followed closely behind, his trained eye automatically cataloging potential threats and escape routes while maintaining the appearance of a respectful bodyguard. Ambassador Vextar dominated the center of the Reptilian Commonwealth section, his massive frame coiled on a specialized platform designed to accommodate his serpentine lower body. His scales shifted from deep green to an angry red as his eyes fixed on the approaching prince. The reptilian's forked tongue flicked out repeatedly, a sign of extreme agitation that Marcus recognized from his xenobiology training. "So the human princeling returns," Vextar hissed, his words translated through speakers embedded in the chamber walls. "Perhaps now we can discuss your species' continued violations of established territorial boundaries and your apparent inability to respect the sovereignty of established civilizations." George stopped precisely in the center of the circle, a position that put him within striking distance of half the assembled delegates. Marcus tensed, ready to intervene if any of them made threatening moves, but the prince seemed completely at ease despite being surrounded by potential enemies. "Ambassador Vextar," George replied, his voice carrying the formal tone he'd learned from years of diplomatic training. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Humanity has violated no territorial boundaries. Every colony we've established has been in previously unclaimed systems, properly surveyed and registered according to galactic law." The Zoltharian delegate, a crystalline being whose body sparkled with internal light, chimed in with a sound like wind through glass. "Prince George, while your statement is technically accurate, it ignores the spirit of galactic expansion protocols. Your species claims systems at a rate that prevents other civilizations from proper consideration and evaluation." Marcus watched the prince's jaw clench slightly, a warning sign that George's famous temper was building. The captain had seen this progression before, during the Martian negotiations. First came the formal diplomatic responses, then gradually increasing passion, and finally, an explosion of royal fury that tended to end diplomatic careers. "Delegate Crystalline," George said, using the formal title rather than the Zoltharian's unpronounceable actual name. "Humanity surveys and claims systems efficiently because we have the technology and resources to do so effectively. We're not required to slow our expansion to accommodate species who lack our capabilities. A rumble of discontent passed through several sections of the council. The ursine delegate, a massive bear-like creature whose people had only achieved spaceflight 2 centuries ago, rose to his full 3-meter height. Young prince, your words carry the arrogance that many of us have come to expect from your species. Perhaps a slower approach would benefit not just other species, but humanity itself. Marcus noted how quickly the conversation was turning personal. These weren't discussions about policy or law anymore. They were attacks on human character and capability. The captain's hand moved slightly closer to his sidearm, though he hoped violence wouldn't be necessary. Starting a firefight in the Galactic Council chamber would end more than just Prince George's diplomatic career. Ambassador Urso, George replied, his voice beginning to carry an edge. Humanity has been expanding responsibly for over 3 centuries. Our colonies are well-established, prosperous, and contribute significantly to galactic trade and knowledge. What you call arrogance, we call competence. Vextar's scales shifted to a deeper shade of red as he raised himself to his full height, towering over the human prince. Competence? Is it competent to establish mining operations and systems that disrupt established trade routes? Is it competent to terraform planets without considering the impact on neighboring systems' ecosystems? Your species acts first and considers consequences later, if at all. The accusation hit close to home, and Marcus could see that Prince George recognized the validity of some of Vextar's points. Humanity's expansion had indeed been aggressive, sometimes causing unintended consequences for other species. The Kepler mining operation that the Zeltharians had complained about earlier had changed the gravitational dynamics of an entire system, affecting shipping routes that other species had used for centuries. Ambassador, George said carefully, every species in this council has made mistakes during their expansion periods. The difference is that humanity learns from our errors and works to prevent them in the future. Can the same be said for all council members? The question was a direct challenge to the reptilian Commonwealth, whose own expansion history included several incidents of environmental destruction and the displacement of primitive species. Vextar's tongue flicked out rapidly, a clear sign that the ambassador was losing his composure. How dare you compare humanity's brief, chaotic expansion to the measured, careful growth of established civilizations? Vextar's voice rose to a near roar. Your species has existed in space for barely 3 centuries. Yet you act as though you deserve equal standing with civilizations that have navigated the stars for millennia. Marcus saw the moment when Prince George's diplomatic restraint finally snapped. The prince's eyes blazed with sudden fury, and his posture shifted from respectful attention to aggressive confrontation. The captain knew he had perhaps seconds to prevent an international incident. Measured and careful, George shot back, his voice carrying throughout the chamber. Is that what you call the reptilian Commonwealth's expansion into the Tau Ceti system? Because I seem to recall reading about how your people stripped 3 planets bare of resources and left the indigenous population to starve. A shocked silence fell over the chamber. The Tau Ceti incident was one of the most shameful episodes in recent galactic history, but it was also a topic that most species avoided discussing in official settings. Bringing it up was a serious diplomatic breach that would have consequences far beyond this council session. Vextar's entire body began to glow with fury, his bioluminescent patches flashing in patterns that Marcus's xenobiology training identified as warnings of imminent violence. The reptilian ambassador was losing control, and several other delegates were beginning to show signs of agitation as well. You insolent child! Vextar roared, raising his massive bulk and moving toward Prince George with surprising speed. How dare you speak of matters you don't understand? Your species should be grateful we permit you to exist among civilized beings. Marcus moved instantly, stepping between the ambassador and the prince just as Vextar's clawed hand swept toward George's head. The captain's cybernetic reflexes allowed him to catch the reptilian's wrist in a grip that stopped the attack cold, though the impact sent vibrations through his reinforced bones. Ambassador Vextar, Marcus said in a calm, steady voice that carried clearly through the chamber, I must ask you to step back and lower your voice. Physical violence against a member of the Terran royal family would constitute an act of war under Article 12 of the Galactic Peace Accords. The reminder of legal consequences seemed to penetrate through Vextar's rage, and the massive reptilian slowly pulled his hand back. But the damage was already done. Multiple council members were on their feet, some demanding explanations, others calling for formal sanctions, and a few simply trying to restore order to the chaos. Prince George, however, seemed energized by the confrontation rather than chastened. "Thank you, Captain Kane. Ambassador Vextar has just demonstrated exactly the kind of measured, civilized behavior that humanity is supposedly lacking." Marcus realized that the situation was spiraling completely out of control. The prince was now actively antagonizing the other delegates. Several species were taking sides in the argument, and the carefully constructed diplomatic relationships that Earth had spent decades building were crumbling in real time. "Your Highness," Marcus said quietly, moving closer to the prince. "Perhaps we should request a recess to allow tempers to cool." "Absolutely not," George replied, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "I think it's time these established civilizations heard some uncomfortable truths about humanity's place in the galaxy." The prince turned to address the full council, his posture radiating confidence and defiance. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of various other classifications, you've spent this entire session discussing humanity as though we were children who need your permission to exist. You've questioned our expansion, criticized our methods, and suggested that we should be grateful for your tolerance." Delegate Crystalline chimed urgently. "Prince George, please reconsider your words. This council has always sought to maintain peaceful relationships with all member species." "Peaceful relationships?" George laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You mean relationships where humanity accepts whatever restrictions you choose to impose, where we thank you for allowing us to colonize systems you've deemed unworthy of your own attention." The cetacean delegate, speaking through their water-filled environment suit, produced a series of clicks and whistles that the universal translator rendered as, "Young Prince, your species' rapid expansion has indeed created challenges for established trade and territorial agreements. Surely you can understand our concerns." George turned toward the aquatic delegate, his expression softening slightly. The cetaceans had generally been fair in their dealings with humanity, and their concerns were typically based on practical considerations rather than prejudice. "Delegate Aquarius, I do understand your concerns, and humanity has always been willing to work with your people on mutually beneficial solutions. But what I will not accept is the suggestion that humanity should restrict our natural growth to make other species more comfortable." Marcus watched the reactions around the chamber, noting which delegates seemed sympathetic to the prince's words and which appeared hostile. The situation was becoming a test of humanity's standing in the galactic community, with the outcome potentially affecting Earth's relationships for decades to come. Ambassador Vextar, having regained some measure of control, interjected with a hiss. "Natural growth? You call the systematic exploitation of resources and the displacement of established shipping routes natural? Your species takes whatever it wants and leaves others to deal with the consequences. And what would you have us do instead?" George demanded. "Sit quietly in the Sol system and wait for your permission to expand? Accept that humanity will always be treated as a junior partner in galactic affairs." The chamber erupted in multiple conversations as delegates began arguing among themselves about humanity's proper role in galactic civilization. Marcus realized that the council session had effectively ended as a diplomatic gathering and become something more like a trial, with humanity itself as the defendant. Prince George seemed to thrive in the chaos, moving around the chamber to address different groups of delegates directly. "Delegate Urso, your people achieved spaceflight 200 years ago with human assistance. We shared our technology freely, without demanding restrictions on your expansion. Why should humanity accept treatment that we would never impose on others?" The Ursine delegate's response was a low growl that the translator rendered as, "Perhaps because your expansion threatens the stability of established galactic order." "Established galactic order?" George's voice rose again. "You mean the order where humanity provides technology, resources, and innovation, but remains forever subordinate to species who achieve spaceflight earlier through random chance?" Marcus decided that the situation had gone far enough. The prince was making valid points, but his delivery was creating enemies faster than he was winning arguments. The captain activated his secure communication link to alert the other royal guards to prepare for immediate extraction if necessary. "Your Highness," Marcus said quietly, moving closer to George, "perhaps we should consider a strategic withdrawal to allow for private negotiations." But Prince George was beyond listening to caution. 3 days of diplomatic frustration, combined with the stress of the Europa situation and years of accumulated resentment over humanity's treatment by the galactic community, had finally reached a breaking point. "No, Captain," George said firmly. "These issues need to be addressed here and now, in front of the full council. Humanity deserves better than backroom deals and private compromises that keep us in a subordinate position." As the arguments continued around them, Marcus began to formulate contingency plans for getting Prince George safely off the station if the situation deteriorated further. The captain's primary responsibility was protecting his charge, even if that meant ending the prince's diplomatic career in the process. The tension in the council chamber had reached a critical point when the massive doors at the far end suddenly opened with a resonant clang. Every head turned as a figure strode into the room with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Marcus felt his heart sink as he recognized the newcomer, even before the ceremonial announcements began. His Royal Majesty, King William V of Terra, protector of human space and sovereign of the colonial territories, announced the automated protocol system, its voice echoing through the suddenly silent chamber. Prince George's face went pale as his father entered the council chamber, flanked by his own security detail and several high-ranking military officers. The king's expression was thunderous, his jaw set in the kind of rigid line that Marcus recognized from years of service to the royal family. King William had clearly received detailed reports about the deteriorating diplomatic situation, and his presence here meant that he considered the matter serious enough to abandon the crisis on Europa. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, stepping forward and offering a formal salute. "We weren't expecting your arrival." King William's cold blue eyes fixed on his son, who remained standing in the center of the council circle with his ceremonial robes disheveled and his hair mussed from the confrontation. "Captain Kane, I received some very disturbing reports from Lord Chancellor Harrison about my son's conduct during these proceedings. I decided that the situation required immediate royal intervention." The assembled alien delegates remained silent, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing a significant moment in human politics. Ambassador Vextar had coiled his massive form into a watchful position, his scales still showing traces of red from his earlier anger, but now modulated with the purple tones that indicated wariness. Prince George straightened his shoulders and faced his father with as much dignity as he could muster. "Father, I was defending humanity's interest against unreasonable restrictions and unfair characterizations of our expansion policies. Were you?" King William's voice carried the kind of icy control that Marcus had learned to fear more than any shouting. "From the reports I received, you were engaging in personal attacks against council members and making inflammatory statements about historical events that have no bearing on current negotiations." The king moved into the center of the chamber, his presence immediately shifting the entire dynamic of the room. Where Prince George had seemed young and passionate, King William projected the kind of seasoned authority that came from decades of ruling an interstellar empire. His uniform bore the decorations of someone who had fought in real wars and made life and death decisions for billions of people. "Ambassador Vextar," the king said, turning toward the reptilian delegate with a formal bow. "I offer my sincere apologies for any offense my son may have caused during these proceedings. His words do not reflect official Terran policy or the views of the royal government." Vextar's tongue flicked out thoughtfully before he responded. "Your Majesty, while I appreciate your gesture, the issues raised go beyond mere diplomatic courtesy. Your son's statements reflect attitudes that many of us believe are prevalent throughout human space." George started to respond, but his father cut him off with a sharp gesture. "My son will not be speaking further during these proceedings. Captain Kane, please escort Prince George to his quarters and ensure that he remains there until I can deal with this matter personally." Marcus felt the weight of conflicting loyalties settling on his shoulders. His primary duty was to protect Prince George, but he also served the crown and couldn't directly disobey a royal command. However, he also knew that forcibly removing the prince from the council chamber would create an even worse diplomatic incident. Your Majesty, Marcus said carefully. Perhaps a brief recess would allow for private family consultation before any formal actions are taken. King William's expression suggested that he was not in the mood for diplomatic suggestions from his son's bodyguard. Captain, you have your orders. Please carry them out immediately. Prince George stepped forward, his own anger finally matching his father's. I'm not a child to be sent to my room, father. I'm a member of this council with a right to represent humanity's interests. You're a representative who has failed in his duties and created an international incident, King William shot back. Your behavior here today has damaged relationships that took decades to build. The exchange was becoming increasingly personal, and Marcus realized that the alien delegates were watching with fascination as the human royal family aired their grievances in public. This kind of family drama was exactly what Earth's enemies would use to argue that humanity was too unstable for galactic leadership. Your Majesty, Your Highness, Marcus interrupted, stepping between father and son. Perhaps this discussion would be better conducted in private. The council chamber is not the appropriate venue for internal royal disagreements. Both men turned toward him with expressions that suggested they had forgotten about their audience. King William recovered first, straightening his uniform and nodding curtly. You're quite right, Captain. However, my orders remain unchanged. Please escort my son to his quarters. George's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. This is exactly the problem. Even our own government treats me like a subordinate rather than a partner. How can we expect respect from other species when we don't even respect ourselves? The outburst was the final straw for Marcus. The captain had spent years protecting Prince George from physical threats, political enemies, and his own poor judgment, but this situation was beyond anything he'd encountered before. The prince was essentially challenging the authority of the crown in front of representatives from 12 alien species, creating a constitutional crisis in addition to a diplomatic one. Your Highness, Marcus said firmly, moving closer to George, I'm going to have to insist that you come with me immediately. Your father has given a direct order, and continuing this argument will only make the situation worse. George looked around the chamber, perhaps finally recognizing how badly the situation had deteriorated. Several delegates were whispering among themselves, while others were taking notes that would undoubtedly find their way into official reports to their home governments. The prince's attempt to defend humanity had instead provided their critics with ammunition for future arguments about human instability. Fine, George said bitterly, adjusting his ceremonial robes. But this doesn't end here, father. These issues still need to be addressed, regardless of how you feel about my methods. King William's expression softened slightly, showing a hint of the paternal concern that lay beneath his royal authority. George, your passion for humanity's welfare is admirable, but passion without wisdom is dangerous. We'll discuss this privately after I've finished repairing the damage you've caused. Marcus placed a firm but respectful hand on Prince George's elbow, guiding him toward the chamber exit. As they walked, the captain could feel the eyes of every delegate following their progress. The image of a human prince being escorted from the council chamber by his own bodyguard would become part of galactic political lore, regardless of how the current crisis was resolved. Just before they reached the exit, Prince George stopped and turned back toward the assembled delegates. Before I go, I want to make one thing clear. Humanity will continue to expand, explore, and claim our rightful place among the stars. We'll do it with or without your approval, but we'd prefer to do it as partners rather than adversaries. The statement was defiant rather than conciliatory, and Marcus saw several delegates exchange worried glances. Ambassador Vextar's scales shifted toward red again, while the cetacean delegate produced a series of agitated clicks. Even the normally peaceful crystalline being seemed to dim slightly, indicating displeasure. King William's voice carried clearly across the chamber. Captain Kane, remove my son immediately. This time, Marcus didn't hesitate. He grasped Prince George's arm firmly and guided him through the exit, closing the massive doors behind them with a sound that seemed to echo through the diplomatic wing. As they walked down the corridor, Marcus could hear the king beginning what was clearly going to be a lengthy apology to the assembled delegates. Well, George said after they had walked in silence for several minutes, that could have gone better. Marcus almost laughed despite the seriousness of the situation. Your Highness, with all due respect, that was a complete diplomatic disaster. Your father will be lucky if he can prevent formal protests from half the species in the council. Maybe, George admitted, his anger beginning to fade into something resembling regret. But at least I said what needed to be said. Humanity can't continue accepting second-class treatment just to keep other species comfortable. They had reached the prince's quarters, and Marcus activated the security systems that would ensure George remained inside until further notice. The rooms were luxurious, but would effectively serve as a prison until the king decided how to handle the situation. Your Highness, Marcus said as they entered the main sitting room, I understand your frustration with humanity's treatment by the galactic community. But creating enemies won't solve the problem. George moved to the large window that overlooked the palace gardens, where various alien species continued their informal meetings and discussions. Look at them, Marcus. Working together, sharing resources and knowledge. That's what the galaxy could be like if they'd treat us as equals instead of dangerous children. Perhaps, Marcus replied, but earning that treatment requires demonstrating the kind of wisdom and restraint that your father mentioned. Today's performance didn't exactly showcase humanity's diplomatic maturity. The prince turned from the window with a rueful smile. You're right, of course. I'll let my emotions get the better of my judgment. But I won't apologize for defending our species' right to exist as equals in the galactic community. Marcus's communication implant chimed with an incoming message from King William. The text was brief but ominous. Council session extended indefinitely. Multiple species demanding formal responses to Prince George's statements. Situation deteriorating rapidly. Maintain security protocols until further notice. Your Highness, Marcus said, I'm afraid the situation in the council chamber is getting worse. Your father is dealing with formal complaints from multiple species. George's expression grew serious as he considered the implications. What kind of complaints? The message doesn't specify, but given the reactions I saw in the chamber, I suspect some species are questioning humanity's continued membership in the council. The possibility of expulsion from a galactic council was something that had never seriously been considered before. Humanity had been a member in good standing for over 50 years, contributing significantly to galactic trade, exploration, and technological development. But diplomatic relationships that took decades to build could be destroyed in a single afternoon. We need to find out exactly what's happening in that chamber, George said, beginning to pace around the room. If other species are using my outburst as an excuse to attack humanity's position in the galaxy, then my father needs to know what we're really dealing with. Marcus considered the request carefully. His orders were to keep Prince George confined to his quarters, but gathering intelligence about the ongoing council session fell within his security responsibilities. I can monitor the diplomatic channels and provide updates on the proceedings, but you need to remain here until your father gives different instructions. Agreed, George said quickly, but I want to know everything that happens. If humanity's future in the galactic community is being decided, I need to understand the full scope of what we're facing. As Marcus activated his monitoring systems and began accessing the diplomatic communication networks, both men realized that the consequences of the afternoon's events would extend far beyond a simple family disagreement. The future of human expansion, Earth's relationships with alien species, and the royal family's credibility were all hanging in the balance. 3 hours had passed since Marcus confined Prince George to his quarters, and the diplomatic situation was spiraling into something resembling a galactic crisis. The captain's monitoring equipment provided a constant stream of encrypted communications between the council chamber and various alien homeworlds, most of which painted an increasingly dire picture of humanity's standing in the galactic community. The Arcturus Trade Federation is threatening to suspend all commercial agreements with human colonies, Marcus reported, reading from his tactical display. The Vegan Republic is demanding a formal investigation into human expansion policies, and the Zeltharian Assembly is calling for immediate restrictions on terraforming operations. Prince George stood at the window, watching as alien delegates moved through the palace gardens in small groups, their body language suggesting intense discussions. And the Reptilian Commonwealth? Ambassador Vextar is pushing for humanity's temporary suspension from council voting rights pending a full review of our aggressive expansion doctrine, Marcus said grimly. Your father is fighting it, but he's running out of allies. The prince turned from the window, his expression a mixture of regret and defiance. So my honest assessment of humanity's position has given our enemies exactly what they needed to attack us directly. Marcus had been thinking the same thing, though he wouldn't have phrased it quite so bluntly. Prince George's outburst had provided ammunition for species that had always resented humanity's rapid rise in galactic affairs. What should have been a routine diplomatic session had become a referendum on mankind's right to equal treatment among the stars. Your Highness, there may be more going on here than just reaction to today's events. My intelligence contacts suggest that several species have been coordinating opposition to human expansion for months. Your confrontation with Ambassador Vextar may have simply provided them with a convenient excuse to make their move. George moved to his desk and activated the secure communication terminal that connected him to Earth's intelligence networks. The screens displayed a complex web of diplomatic relationships, trade agreements, and military alliances that revealed the true scope of galactic politics. Humanity's position looked increasingly isolated as various species aligned themselves against human interests. "Look at this," George said, pointing to a cluster of red indicators on the strategic display. 6 species have formal defense agreements that specifically mention containment of aggressive expansion by newer civilizations. That's not a reaction to my behavior today. That's a coordinated strategy that's been in development for years. Marcus studied the display, recognizing several patterns that he'd seen in intelligence briefings about potential threats to human space. The timing is suspicious. Why make their move now, when humanity's military is dealing with the Europa crisis and our diplomatic corps is stretched thin across multiple negotiations? Because they think we're vulnerable, George replied, his voice carrying a new note of urgency. Father pulled our best ships to investigate the attacks on Europa, and our diplomatic attention has been focused on trade agreements rather than military preparedness. This was planned. The realization was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. Humanity's rapid expansion had created economic and territorial pressures that threatened established galactic power structures. Species that had dominated interstellar politics for millennia suddenly found themselves competing with aggressive newcomers who possessed superior technology and an apparently unlimited appetite for new worlds. Marcus's communication implant chimed with another urgent message from the council chamber. This time, the text made his blood run cold. Formal vote scheduled for tomorrow morning on Galactic Council Resolution 2847. Temporary suspension of human colonial rights, pending comprehensive review. Multiple species supporting. King requests immediate consultation with Prince George despite previous orders. Your Highness, Marcus said, showing the message to George. Your father wants to see you immediately. The council is moving toward a formal vote on restricting human expansion. George read the message twice before responding. Temporary suspension of colonial rights. Do you understand what that means, Marcus? They're trying to legally prevent humanity from claiming new systems or establishing new colonies. They want to freeze human expansion while they debate our right to exist as equals. The implications were staggering. Humanity's economy depended heavily on resources extracted from colonial worlds, and many of Earth's most advanced industries relied on rare materials found only in specific star systems. A suspension of colonial rights would cripple human civilization's growth and potentially trigger an economic collapse that would affect billions of people. We need to get to that council chamber, George said, moving toward his formal diplomatic uniform. Whether Father wants my help or not, humanity needs every voice we can muster. Marcus faced a difficult decision. His orders were to keep Prince George confined until further notice, but those orders had been given before the situation escalated to this level. The captain's ultimate responsibility was protecting human interests, and that might require allowing the prince to participate in the crucial upcoming negotiations. Your Highness, your father specifically requested consultation, not participation. Perhaps we should determine exactly what he wants before taking any action that might make the situation worse. George paused in reaching for his ceremonial robes. You're right, but I want to be ready to act if the situation requires it. Can you establish a secure communication link with the council chamber? Marcus activated his emergency communication protocols, creating a heavily encrypted channel that would allow them to speak directly with King William without alerting other species to their conversation. Within moments, the king's face appeared on the secure display, showing signs of exhaustion and stress that spoke to the difficulty of the ongoing negotiations. George, King William said without preamble. I need to know exactly what you said to Ambassador Vextar about the Tau Ceti incident. Several species are claiming that you made specific threats regarding historical grievances. Prince George moved closer to the display. I mentioned the incident to point out the hypocrisy of Vextar, calling human expansion chaotic and destructive. I didn't make any threats, just stated historical facts that are part of the public record. The reptilian Commonwealth is characterizing your comments as inflammatory revisionism designed to justify future human aggression, the king replied. They're using your words to support their argument that humanity cannot be trusted with unrestricted expansion rights. Marcus watched the conversation with growing concern. The aliens were clearly using selective interpretation to transform Prince George's defensive comments into evidence of human belligerence. It was a sophisticated political attack that suggested careful coordination and planning. Father, George said urgently, this isn't really about my behavior today. I've been analyzing the diplomatic intelligence networks, and there's evidence that multiple species have been planning this move for months. The confrontation with Vextar was just the excuse they needed. King William's expression grew thoughtful as he considered his son's analysis. Explain. 6 species have defense agreements that specifically reference containing newer civilizations, and the timing of this crisis coincides perfectly with our military deployment to Europa. They've been waiting for a moment when humanity appears vulnerable and distracted. The king was silent for several seconds, clearly processing this information. Captain Kane, what's your assessment of the prince's analysis? Marcus had been dreading this question, knowing that his answer might determine the course of humanity's future in the galactic community. Your Majesty, the intelligence patterns support Prince George's conclusions. The coordinated nature of today's responses suggests advanced planning rather than spontaneous reaction. I see. King William's voice carried a new note of grim determination. In that case, George, I need you to join me in the council chamber. We're facing a coordinated political attack, and I'll need your knowledge of these species' historical grievances to counter their arguments effectively. Prince George straightened immediately. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Father. Captain Kane, the king continued, escort my son to the chamber, but maintain high security protocols. If this is indeed a coordinated attack, there may be other elements we haven't identified yet. Marcus saluted sharply. Understood, Your Majesty. We'll be there shortly. As the communication link closed, both men began preparing for what would likely be the most crucial diplomatic session in human history. Prince George donned his ceremonial robes, while Marcus checked his weapons and communication systems, ensuring that he was ready for any eventuality. Marcus, George said as they prepared to leave, whatever happens in that council chamber, remember that we're not just defending my behavior or even my father's policies. We're defending humanity's right to exist as equals in the galactic community. The captain nodded grimly. Understood, Your Highness. But remember that this time, we're walking into a deliberate trap. The other species know exactly what they're doing, and they've had months to prepare their arguments. Then, we'll have to be better than they expect, George replied. Humanity didn't reach the stars by accepting limitations imposed by others. We're not going to start now. As they walked toward the council chamber, Marcus reflected on how quickly the situation had evolved from a simple diplomatic dispute to a potential war of civilizations. Prince George's passionate defense of humanity had revealed deeper currents of resentment and fear among the alien species, forces that had been building for decades while humanity focused on expansion and exploration. The corridor leading to the council chamber was now lined with security personnel from multiple species, their various forms of armor and weapons creating an intimidating gauntlet that spoke to the seriousness of the situation. Marcus noted the positions of potential allies and enemies, calculating response times and escape routes while maintaining the appearance of a routine escort. Ready? George asked as they approached the massive doors. Marcus checked his equipment one final time. Ready, Your Highness. But this time we're not just facing diplomatic opposition. We're walking into a coordinated attempt to cripple human civilization. Then, we'd better make sure they fail, Prince George replied, pushing open the doors to face humanity's greatest challenge since first contact with alien life. The council chamber had been transformed during Prince George's absence. What had been a circular arrangement of equal delegates now resembled a courtroom, with humanity clearly positioned as the defendant. King William stood alone in the center, facing a semicircle of alien representatives whose body language radiated hostility and determination. The sight made Marcus's hand move instinctively toward his sidearm, though he knew that violence would only prove the aliens' arguments about human aggression. "Ah, Prince George returns," Ambassador Vextar announced, his scales now displaying the deep red patterns that indicated maximum aggression. "Perhaps now we can hear a formal apology for this afternoon's insulting behavior." Prince George walked steadily to his father's side, his ceremonial robes rustling in the sudden silence. Marcus noted that several new faces had appeared among the alien delegates, including representatives from species that had previously been neutral in galactic politics. The scope of the opposition to humanity was larger than anyone had anticipated. "Ambassador Vextar," George said in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber, "I regret that my words this afternoon were interpreted as insults. However, I will not apologize for defending humanity's right to equal treatment in the galactic community." A ripple of angry sounds passed through the assembled delegates. The Ursine representative rose to his full impressive height, growling words that the universal translator rendered as equal treatment. "Your species demands privileges that others have earned through millennia of responsible expansion." King William stepped forward, clearly intending to defuse the situation before it escalated again. "Honored delegates, perhaps we should focus on the specific issues rather than engaging in further accusations. The Terran Empire is willing to address any legitimate concerns about our expansion policies." Legitimate concerns? The voice came from a new speaker, a member of the Aquilan hegemony, whose people resembled massive eagles with technological augmentations. Prince George's behavior today merely confirmed what many of us have suspected for years. Humanity views diplomacy as weakness and negotiation as surrender. Marcus watched Prince George's reaction carefully, knowing that the prince's famous temper was being deliberately provoked. But instead of the explosion that everyone expected, George seemed to calm himself, drawing on reserves of diplomatic training that Marcus hadn't known existed. "Delegate Skyfall," George said, using the Aquilan's formal title. "May I ask what specific actions by humanity have led you to this conclusion? Because from my perspective, we've consistently honored our treaties, shared our technology freely, and contributed substantially to galactic prosperity." The Aquilan's feathered crest rose in agitation. "Your expansion rate exceeds every other species in recorded history. You claim systems faster than existing civilizations can evaluate their potential. You terraform planets without considering the long-term environmental impacts on neighboring systems. And yet," George replied steadily, "our colonies are successful, our trade relationships are profitable for all parties, and our technological innovations have benefited every species in this chamber. Are we to be punished for competence?" Ambassador Vextar slammed his massive tail against the floor, creating a sound like thunder. "Competence? Is it competent to destabilize established trade routes? To disrupt shipping lanes that have been in use for centuries? To extract resources at rates that affect the economic balance of entire sectors?" Marcus realized that the aliens were presenting legitimate grievances alongside their obvious prejudices. Humanity's rapid expansion had indeed caused disruptions to established galactic systems, though these effects had generally been unintentional side effects of successful colonization rather than deliberate attacks on alien interests. King William stepped into the discussion with the authority of someone who had spent decades navigating these complex relationships. "Ambassador Vextar, the Terran Empire acknowledges that our expansion has sometimes created unintended consequences for other species. We have always been willing to negotiate compensation and adjustments when specific damages could be demonstrated." Compensation? The word came from the crystalline delegate, whose internal light pulsed with what Marcus recognized as extreme agitation. What compensation exists for the loss of territorial sovereignty? For the erosion of established political balances that have maintained peace for millennia? Prince George stepped forward, and Marcus tensed, ready to intervene if the situation required it. But instead of the confrontational approach that had characterized his earlier behavior, the prince spoke with surprising diplomatic sophistication. "Delegate Crystalline, with respect, the established political balances you reference were created without humanity's input or consent. We were admitted to the galactic community as junior members with limited rights and extensive restrictions. The question is whether those balances serve the interests of all sentient beings or only those who benefited from our exclusion? The observation hit home with several delegates, who exchanged uncomfortable glances. The early years of human integration into galactic politics had indeed been marked by discriminatory policies and unequal treatment, issues that most species preferred not to discuss in formal settings. Prince George raises an important point, said a new voice from the back of the chamber. Marcus turned to see Delegate Harmony of the Centaurian Alliance, one of the few species that had consistently maintained fair relationships with humanity. Perhaps we should examine whether our current crisis stems from legitimate policy disagreements or from unresolved issues related to humanity's original integration into galactic society. Ambassador Vextar's scales shifted to an even deeper shade of red. The Centaurian Alliance has always been overly sympathetic to human interests. Your perspective is hardly objective. My perspective, Delegate Harmony replied coolly, is based on 40 years of successful cooperation with human colonies. The Centaurian-Terran trade agreements have been mutually beneficial, and human technological assistance has improved living conditions throughout our territory. Marcus watched as the chamber began to divide into clear factions. The Reptilian Commonwealth, Ursine Federation, and Aquiline Hegemony formed the core of anti-human sentiment, while the Centaurian Alliance and a few smaller species seemed willing to defend humanity's position. The larger question was where the neutral species would align themselves when the formal vote was called. Prince George seemed to sense the shifting dynamics as well. Honored delegates, I believe we're facing a fundamental question about the nature of galactic civilization. Should it be a static system that preserves existing power structures, or a dynamic community that adapts to accommodate new members and new possibilities? Dynamic adaptation? The Ursine delegate's growl carried clear menace. Is that what you call the systematic disruption of established territories and trade relationships? I call it growth, George replied firmly. Every species in this chamber has benefited from territorial expansion and technological development. The difference is that humanity has achieved in 3 centuries what others accomplished over millennia, and some of you seem to resent our success rather than learning from it. The accusation of resentment clearly struck home with several delegates, but it also pushed the discussion toward dangerous territory. Marcus could see that Prince George was walking a fine line between defending humanity and provoking another diplomatic crisis. King William apparently recognized the same danger. Perhaps we should focus on specific proposals rather than general principles. The Terran Empire is prepared to consider reasonable modifications to our expansion policies if other species will engage in good faith negotiations. What modifications? Ambassador Vextar demanded. Will you accept mandatory review periods before claiming new systems? Will you submit to external oversight of your terraforming operations? Will you acknowledge that your expansion rights are subject to community approval rather than unilateral decision-making? The proposals were clearly designed to cripple humanity's ability to compete effectively in galactic expansion. Mandatory review periods would allow other species to claim systems while humans waited for bureaucratic approval. External oversight would compromise proprietary terraforming technology, and community approval would give hostile species veto power over human development. Prince George started to respond, but his father raised a hand to stop him. Ambassador Vextar, those proposals would effectively end human expansion while imposing no similar restrictions on other species. That's not negotiation. That's surrender disguised as diplomacy. Perhaps surrender is what's required. The Ursine delegate rumbled. Perhaps humanity needs to learn that galactic citizenship involves obligations as well as rights. The comment finally pushed Prince George beyond his diplomatic restraint. And what obligations do your species accept? The Ursine Federation has expanded into 6 systems in the past decade without consulting anyone. The Reptilian Commonwealth extracts resources at rates that dwarf human operations. The Aquiline Hegemony maintains territorial claims that haven't been used for productive purposes in over a century. Marcus watched nervously as the prince's voice rose with passion. You demand that humanity accept restrictions that none of you would tolerate for your own species. You want us to ask permission for what you consider your natural right. Ambassador Vextar rose to his full imposing height. Because your species has not earned the trust that comes with responsible expansion. You act first and consider consequences later. We act decisively while others debate endlessly. George shot back. We solve problems while others form committees to study them. We build civilizations, while others argue about territorial boundaries drawn on maps that haven't reflected reality for centuries. The exchange was moving rapidly toward another confrontation, and Marcus realized that he might need to physically intervene to prevent Prince George from destroying humanity's last chances for a diplomatic solution. But before he could act, an unexpected voice interrupted the argument. Enough. The word came from Delegate Aquarius of the Cetacean Assembly, whose people had remained largely silent during the proceedings. This debate has revealed the true nature of our crisis, and it is not about expansion policies or territorial rights. Every head in the chamber turned toward the aquatic delegate, whose water-filled environment suit allowed her to participate in air-breathing discussions. We are witnessing a collision between different concepts of civilization itself. Some species prefer stability and gradual change, while others thrive on rapid growth and adaptation. Neither approach is inherently superior. Ambassador Vexstar's scales shifted toward purple, indicating confusion. What are you suggesting, Delegate Aquarius? I'm suggesting that we stop pretending this is about specific policy disagreements and acknowledge that we are dealing with fundamental incompatibilities between different species' approaches to galactic citizenship. The question is whether we can find a framework that accommodates both perspectives. Prince George looked thoughtful. What kind of framework? Territorial segregation, Delegate Aquarius replied. Designated expansion zones where different species can pursue their preferred approaches without interfering with each other. Rapid expansion species like humanity could claim and develop systems in designated areas, while stability-preferring species could maintain their traditional territories without disruption. The proposal was radical, but potentially workable. Marcus could see various delegates considering the implications, weighing the benefits of separation against the advantages of continued integration. Segregation? King William asked carefully, "Are you suggesting a permanent division of galactic space?" "I am suggesting a practical solution to an otherwise irreconcilable conflict," Delegate Aquarius replied. "The alternative appears to be continued escalation that serves no one's interests." Ambassador Vexstar's scales had shifted to a thoughtful blue. The concept has merit. Humanity could pursue its aggressive expansion without disrupting established systems, while traditional species could maintain their preferred approaches to development. Marcus realized that they were witnessing a potential turning point in galactic history. Instead of the continued integration that had been the goal since first contact, the alien species were seriously considering a formal division that would essentially create separate spheres of influence for different types of civilizations. Prince George seemed to understand the implications as well. Delegate Aquarius, while territorial segregation might solve immediate conflicts, wouldn't it also limit the potential for cooperation and mutual learning? Perhaps, the cetacean replied, but it would also prevent the kind of crisis we are experiencing today. The choice is between imperfect separation and continued conflict. As the chamber fell silent, Marcus realized that humanity stood at a crossroads. They could accept segregation and pursue their destiny among the stars without interference, or continue fighting for integration in a galactic community that seemed determined to constrain their natural growth. Either choice would have profound consequences for the future of human civilization. The vote would come tomorrow, and with it, humanity's answer to the fundamental question of their place in the galaxy.